chapter 23, verses 26 through 49, page 830 and 831 of the Pew Bible. And as they led him away, they seized one Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus. And there followed him a great multitude of people and of women who were mourning and lamenting for him. But turning to them, Jesus said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things while the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" 2 others who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And they cast lots to divide his garments. And the people stood by, watching, but the rulers scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself. If he is the Christ of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, "If you are the King of Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." And he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he said to him, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." It was now about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, when the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And having said this, he breathed his last. Now when the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God, saying, "Certainly this man was innocent." And all the crowds that had assembled for this spectacle, when they saw what had taken place, returned home beating their breasts. And all his acquaintances and the women who had followed him from Galilee stood at a distance, watching these things.
Thank you, Philip. So, to those of you who are currently employed, I don't know if you've ever had this thought. This thought ever runs through your mind, where you think to yourself, what would be the fastest way for me to get fired? Ever had that thought? Well, that thought's crossed my mind from time to time. And I thought to myself, what if I got up here and I just started swearing? I just started rattling off a series of four-letter words. I would imagine that would probably not go over very well here, right? Because swearing is not accepted in church. But actually, the truth of the matter is that swearing isn't accepted anywhere. Now, I know some of you are looking at me with some bewildered looks. You're like, what are you talking about? Pastor, you clearly haven't been to where I work, right? Swearing is perfectly acceptable there. Four-letter words are perfectly acceptable in some of the circles that I'm associated with. What do you mean it's not accepted that it's anywhere to swear? There's all kinds of places where swearing is accepted. But here's the issue, is that it depends on what constitutes swearing. What is swearing? And what I would like to suggest to you is that depending on what situation you're in, what group you're in, swearing is defined differently, or what constitutes a swear word. What constitutes a word that is not appropriate. In other words, if you move outside of the church culture and you move into maybe a secular environment, there are different sets of words that are unacceptable. There are different sets of words that are inappropriate. In fact, I would suggest to you there is one four-letter word that is accepted in church, but it's not outside the church. If you're at work and you use this word a lot, you're probably not going to get the promotion. If you're hanging out with friends outside of a church environment and you use this four-letter word a lot, you might find that you're not invited to the next party. You're likely to get ostracized for using this four-letter word, because that's what it is to many people in our culture. And what is this four-letter word? Here's what it is. I'll spell it out for you. S-I-N, sin. Now, I realize it's only 3 letters, okay? But the word sin is like a 4-letter word in our culture. You see, many people today feel like the word sin, it's an outdated concept. To talk about people's sin, that's a judgmental kind of thing to do, right? Sin, the concept of sin, people say, is something that is not accepted in much of our society today. But here's the irony. Here's the problem with this. The irony is that actually everybody does believe in sin. Even those who claim that the concept of sin is outdated. In other words, sin exists in all cultural contexts. All right. So let me give you a definition of sin to help you understand what I mean by that. Here's a definition of sin. Sin is failing to obey the commands of your God. That's what sin is. Sin in the Bible, there's a Hebrew word that it literally means to miss the mark. So it's a term that was originally used for an archer who would be shooting an arrow towards a target. And if the target represents a command of God that we're commanded to follow, then the arrow that misses the target, misses the mark, that's a sin, right? And so sin is failing to obey the commands of your God. And of course, the God of the Bible gives us commands. The 10 Commandments, right? That's sort of a foundational group of commands. And if we fail to follow those commands, then we are missing the mark. If we fail to follow those commands, then we're failing to live the way He desires for us to live in His kingdom, right? His kingdom, His way. He's saying these are the rules that you should follow if you're going to live in the kingdom of which I am in charge. What's interesting, of course, is that there are other gods in this world. There are other gods that we look to. There are other gods that we follow. And those gods have their own sets of commands. It's interesting because we find this in the 10 Commandments itself, points to this reality. In other words, when we look at the 10 Commandments, we find something interesting that sheds light on sin and takes our understanding of it to another level. We find this in the very first of the 10 Commandments. Exodus 23, here's what it says. It says, "You shall have no other gods before me." Isn't that interesting? That's the first command. You shall have no other gods before me. And so what he's saying is, he's saying, look, I'm going to give you a set of commands, which you are to follow, if you want to be a part of my kingdom. He's like, but before I give you those, let's make sure that it's me you want to follow in the first place. If I'm not your God, then there's no point in me giving you some rules on how to live in my kingdom if that's not really the kingdom that you want to live in. What he's hinting at is that when he says, there shall be no gods before me, he's hinting at there are other gods that you might follow, and if you follow them, then you're going to try to follow the commands that they give you, not the commands that I give you. So let's unpack, let's look at this a little bit practically here, okay? So here's how we're going to understand this practically, is what we're going to do here is we're going to look at some of the gods which I believe we in America worship. So there's the gods of the Bible, the God of the Bible, and then there are the gods that Americans often worship. And so here's what it is. The gods of American society have their own commands. This is the point I'm getting at here. If you don't follow the God of the Bible, you're going to end up following some other God. If you're American, you're likely to follow the gods of America. And the American gods, they have their own commandments, which, if that's your God, you're going to look to follow, right? So here's actually what we're going to do. We're going to look at the 10 commandments of the gods of America. A whole set of commandments, which if these are the gods you follow, then these are the commands you're going to try to follow. Here we go. You ready for this? Here's the first one. Here's the first commandment of the gods of America. Thou shalt have no gods before you. A little bit of an irony here. The gods of America say, okay, you shall have no God before you. In other words, you do what you want to do. And if you don't do what you want to do, if you cave into what other people are doing or what other people tell you should do, you are sinning. The second commandment kind of flows out of that one. Here's another one here. Thou shalt not exercise self-control, but must obey everything your desires tell you to do. Do not hold back, but in all things let it go. Let it go. Let it go. Get behind me, self-control. Right? You all know this song. What's interesting is that the gods of American society, you're not going to find their commandments officially written out anywhere. But the gods of American society have a rich hymnody. In fact, you can listen to the hymns of the gods of American culture every day. Just turn on the radio. You know, K-Love is not the only religious radio station. They're all religious. It's just that those songs are often written to other gods. Okay, here's the third commandment of the gods of American society. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house or wife. You owe it to yourself to never be content with what you have and must surrender completely to the pursuit of more. I mean, if you become content with what you have, it's like burying your treasures in the ground. You wicked, lazy servant. Commandment number 4 of the gods of American society. Thou shalt not stop working out until you look like the latest Bond girl, or else you'll miss out on having your neighbor covet you. I mean, what if you walk out to the mail to get your mail, and what if your neighbor doesn't check you out? Sinner. Right? I mean, when you go to the grocery store, see, and you look on the magazine rack and you see the model on the cover of Vogue magazine. If the gods of American culture are your gods, that's like staring into the law. That's like staring into the law, reading the scriptures, and being convicted of your sin. Number 5. Thou shalt not refuse the sexual advances of someone you are attracted to, nor restrict yourself to staying with the same person. Remember, 60 is the new 20, but with money. Right? Come on, man. You got money now. When you were 20 and you wanted to go off and live the high life, you didn't have any money. Now you got money. You're 60. Why would you stay with the same person? Okay. Where was I here? Oh, yeah, number 6. Thou shalt not take a day of rest, but must never stop, and must work yourself back into the ground from whence you came. I don't know if that's how you use the word whence. I just think it sounds cool. Number 7. Thou shalt not give your children any free time, but must endlessly run them around from one extracurricular activity to the next, or else you are a lazy or cheap parent who is hindering their ability to obtain an acceptable future and thereby robbing yourself of the God-given right to boast about the success of your children. If you aren't driving them to every activity, all of that, you're sinning against the gods of American society. Number 8, thou shalt not make any decisions for your children. But since they are born uncorrupted by society, they are in the best place to make decisions for themselves. We could spend a lot of time unpacking that one, but I'll move on. Number 9, thou shalt not be seen driving the same old car year after year. Really? You're still driving that same blue Honda Civic? Sinner. Number 10, thou shalt not have anyone over unless your house is perfectly clean, or else they will know that you are either lazy or too cheap to hire help. You see, these are the commandments. We could add many more, I'm sure. The gods of American society. And if you fail to obey these commands, you have sinned. You see this? So you see, society says we don't believe in sin, but we've never stopped believing in sin. We've just redefined, we've changed what sin is. And here's the problem. Just like the God of the Bible, the commands of the gods of America are impossible to keep. You see this? So throughout the Bible, throughout the Bible, going all the way back to the fall and then moving through the narrative throughout Genesis, what we discovered time and time again is the people of God failing to keep the law. That's the recurrent theme, right? We find that as soon as the law is given, we find that with Moses and the first generation, it's like Moses hasn't even come down from the mountain with the commandments yet, and the people are already breaking God's commands. And then just throughout the history of the people of Israel, the period of the judges, it's the story of Israel continuing to fail to follow the commands of God over and over and over and over again. And then you get to King David, and finally we got a man after God's own heart. And then Bathsheba shows up on a rooftop, and that goes down. And so just time after time after time, it's the story of the people of Israel, the story of God's people failing to obey the commands of God. When you read the Bible, what you're going to discover is that it's impossible to keep the commands of God. And I actually think this is why, you see, some people don't like going to church. Like, why would you want to go somewhere and study a book that's constantly telling you that you are a sinner? I mean, I get it. I get why people, they don't want that. Like, I don't want anything to do with that, right? The problem is, if you move away from the God of the Bible, you're just going to move to another whole set of gods where the same thing is true. You can't measure up anyway. You're still going to sin. I remember there was a movie that came out a number of years ago called Whiplash. And it won at least one Academy Award. I'm not necessarily recommending it. It has some 4-letter words. So I'm not recommending this movie necessarily, but just letting you know that. But the movie is the story of this kid, college student, who is trying to follow the commands of his God. And who is his God? It's his college jazz band teacher. Like, music is his world. Music is the kingdom in which he lives. And so the jazz band teacher is like his God who lays out the commands for him. And it's the story of him trying to measure up. And of course, the commands of the jazz band teacher are different. They're not based on his morality. They're based on like his tempo. Can he keep a solid tempo? does he know how to use dynamics. And if he speeds up, he sins. And if he slows down, he sins. And his teacher is always on him, calling him out for his sin. And the whole movie is the story of this kid trying to live up to the commandments that are coming down to him from his God, the jazz band teacher, and he can never measure up. I think that's one of the reasons why this movie was so successful, because we can all identify with him. Madonna. About 20 years ago, there was an interview that she had, and it was about 20 years ago. This was right at the end of kind of the peak of her career. And if you analyze Madonna in terms of the kingdom of the gods of America, she's like a high priest. Like, she's as holy as they come by the standards of the American gods of society. She was recognized by, I can't remember which magazine said this, one of the 25 most powerful women of the 20th century. She sold more albums than any female artist in the 20th century. She was known as the queen of pop. I mean, like, she could enter into the holy of holies in the sanctuary of the gods of America. You see what I'm saying? And even she acknowledged that she really wasn't holy, even by those standards. Listen to what Madonna says. My drive in life is from this horrible fear of being mediocre. And that's what's always pushing me. Because even though I've become somebody, I still have to prove that I'm somebody. My struggle has never ended, and it probably never will. You see, you can always be more successful. You can always be more beautiful. The Apostle Paul says in the book of Romans, chapter 3, he says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. That's true if you're worshiping the God of the Bible. That's also true if you're worshiping the gods of American society. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of whatever gods it is that you happen to be worshiping. So what's the difference? What's the difference between the God of the Bible and the gods of American society? The gods of America won't die for you. With the gods of America, there is no forgiveness. Today we're continuing in our series called The Story. The central theme of this whole series is that the Bible is a story. And it unfolds in these 4 acts: creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. And as I've said, we see God creates everything. He creates it good. He creates us to be in fellowship with Him. But we turn away from Him in Adam. We rebel. And then we see throughout the story of the Bible, though God reaches out to us, nonetheless, we continue to sin. The Israelites, David, the latter kingdom, they all fall, and then Jesus comes, and Jesus just reiterates to the Israelite community that they are in sin. In fact, that's what's going on in this passage that was read this morning. Jesus is calling out the Israelites for their sin. Okay, what's going on here? So, historically, the Roman procurator, the regional Roman ruler over Palestine, he sentences Jesus to death. Now, why does he sentence Jesus to death? Well, the truth is, he does not have a good reason, and he knows it. I mean, he says, what crime has he committed? Okay, but the reality is it's all politics, right? And everybody knows in politics, you don't have to have a reason to do whatever it is that you do. At least you don't have to have a good reason. So for political reasons, which I won't get into, he goes ahead and he has Jesus crucified. So let's pick up here in verse 26. As they led him away, Jesus, they seized Simon from Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country, and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large number of people followed, including women who mourned and wailed for him. Now, what's interesting is there's some scholarly debate about this, but it seems like a number of scholars will say that this crowd that was following Jesus, this group of women who were mourning and wailing for him, they weren't necessarily all his followers. They may have been, there were, of course, his followers that cared about him and that were close to him, but they're also, it's likely that there was just a group of Jewish women that came alongside these followers of Jesus and cried and wailed and mourned with them as Jesus was being taken to the cross. Because actually there's this beautiful custom in first century Judaism where when somebody would experience some kind of hardship or trial or tragedy, so for example, at a funeral in first century Judaism, a group of people would come, even if they didn't know the person who had died or didn't really even know the family. The people in the area, they would come and they would cry and they would moan and they would wail with the family that was crying. And the reason was the truth is that in our culture, in modern funerals, it can often be a little uncomfortable for the family that is emotional. Everybody else is quiet. And so they're crying, but they're actually trying to keep it in because they don't want to make a scene. Well, the way they did it in first century Judaism was everybody just cried and mourned, even the ones who didn't know him. It was actually a way of helping the family to be able to be emotional. It's actually this kind of beautiful custom. And so it seems like that may be what's going on here. In other words, these folks are not necessarily all really close followers of Jesus. They're just Israelites. And so what Jesus then is doing here is he's calling them all out, the Jewish people, for their sin. That's what's going on here. What does he say? But turning to them, Jesus said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" So what he's saying here is, okay, he's calling them out for their sin. And what I mean by that is that he's calling them out for their failure to love. Right? Jesus tells us that all of the commands of God can be summed up in these two commands: love God and love your neighbor. And he's calling out the Israelite people for failing to love their neighbors, and in particular for failing to love their enemies. Right? Throughout Jesus' ministry, we see what it means to love your neighbor is actually to love your enemies. And in particular, what he's saying is you have failed to love the Romans. The Romans, we talked about this last week, they were the occupiers. You have failed to love them, and actually, because you've failed to love them, God's judgment is going to come upon you for your failure to love your enemies. And the way that judgment is going to come is that the very enemies that you're failing to love are going to wipe you out. That's what he's talking about here. And what he's saying is he's saying, look, the Romans, they're crucifying me. I'm innocent. He's like, imagine what they're going to do when you guys come after them. That's what he means by, if that's what they do while it's green, what are they going to do when it's dry? He's saying, I'm innocent and they're killing me. Guess what's going to happen when you guys push your lack of love? And what he's really doing is he's talking about and prophesying about what would happen 30 years later during the Jewish revolt. In fact, this is exactly what happened. The Jewish people continued to not love their enemies, continued to not love the Romans, and what they did is they started a rebellion and they tried to kick the Romans out of Palestine. The problem is that for the Jews to kick the Romans out of Palestine would be like a little ant trying to kick an elephant out of a cave. And especially when God's like, I'm not going to help you because you're supposed to love that elephant in the first place. So Jesus is prophesying about this time when God is going to allow them to be crushed because of their failure to love, because of their sin. So all of this is just highlighting that Jesus is calling them out for their sin. So what is Jesus then saying in light of that prophecy? He's saying, don't do it. Don't do it. And he's saying, let me step in the place of the judgment you deserve. He's saying, let the judgment that's coming towards you in the future, let it fall on me now. Let me take it from you. He's saying, I am innocent, and the Romans are crucifying me. Trust in me rather than rebelling, and let me take the judgment you actually deserve. Let me take it upon myself. Let me die for you. Friends, the heart of the Christian faith is that we have a God who, in the person of Jesus, was willing to take upon himself the judgment that we deserve. Because of our failure to obey the commands of God, we deserve judgment. But he's saying, let me take it for you. And the point is, if you worship any other God, they will not do this for you. If you worship any other God, you will spend your entire life trying to measure up to the commandments that are given. You will continually fail, and there will be no forgiveness. Friends, I encourage you to think about what are the gods that you are worshiping? What are the commands that you're trying to follow? Commands that aren't even in the Bible. They're commands that come from our culture. Turn from those commands to the commands of God. Turn to obedience to him. And recognize that when you fall, you have a God who forgives you. We now come to our time of communion. What is communion all about? Communion is about the forgiveness of God.